Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone. On last week's episode, our guest Jeannie Marie was talking about growing our missional intelligence. One of the ways she suggested we can do this is to get out there, which for many Western churches for the last 2 decades has included short-term missions. That's what this episode is about today. It was back in April 2020 when this pandemic was beginning to unfold that we recorded this conversation with David and Lorene Wilson of Avant about the potential of short-term missions. Now with COVID, of course, short-term missions has been dramatically changed for the foreseeable future. We originally delayed publishing this episode, but what we've decided to do now is release it in between regular episodes, sort of a bonus episode, if you will, entitled 5 Mission Trips to Help Mobilize Your Church. We do hope this topic will still be of value as we have this quiet season now for short-term ministry, and yet we're still planning and preparing for what opportunities the Lord opens in the future. Our guests today are Dave and Lorene Wilson, who have been serving the local church as mission leaders since 1996. Dave and Lorene currently serve together as directors of church relations at Avant Ministries in the U.S. office in Kansas City, Missouri. They are also authors and have written 3 books together, including the book we'll talk about today called Pipeline, Engaging the Church in Missionary Mobilization. Dave and Lorene, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mags. It's great to be there.
Thanks for having us.
Well, as we record this, we've talked about this before we started today. It's a very unusual season. Much of the world is under some type of lockdown. It's early April 2020. Such unusual days. And we want to, even in these podcasts, think both about the present, but also the future. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation where it's going to come out of this book. It's a bright yellow book that I like to recommend called Pipeline. I wonder if you'd begin, you guys, just by helping us understand what led you to write this book, Pipeline. Why did you write it at this point?
Well, after spending so many years serving the church and then coming to the mission agency, we started noticing that the church was often either missing in the conversation or left out of the conversation of mobilizing the next generation of missionaries. And we just really had a strong leaning to do something, to write about our experiences, how we mobilized people in the past. And then we started hearing all these other churches that were doing great things. And so we started inviting other people to be a part of the research. We wanted to find out what other churches were doing, other mission pastors, even mission agency leaders and mission coaches. And we just invited a whole bunch of people into the conversation. And originally we were going to write it ourselves after our research. But then we started saying, these people all have wonderful stories to tell, and it needs to come from their voice. So we were blessed to have 40 people say yes, contributing to the work.
Mm-hmm. I guess you could say even the book is sort of in a curated style. It's true, it's your book, and obviously you've assembled this information, but there are actually many authors, right? You've curated this content and brought it together in a book.
Yeah, we put together the structure, we outlined it, had it all set up to where we're heading in a certain direction. And I wrote a vast majority of the content that was providing the structure and put the bones all together. And then all of our participating authors and contributors, they kind of filled in all the parts and pieces and just shared their vision and their story for mobilizing the next generation.
Super. Well, I do recommend this book. It's actually one of the few books, Dave, that I have both a physical copy and a Kindle copy. And so that says something there. And Dave and Lorene have really put together a valuable contemporary resource for missions committees. It's entitled Pipeline, Engaging the Church in Missionary Mobilization. Now, in one of these chapters, you describe best practices that you've observed in successful or fruitful sending churches. Could you briefly share with us what those best practices are?
Sure. Well, we interviewed quite a lot of successful sending churches, those that wrote in the book and so many others and ones we served in. And they were doing so many of the same things. In that chapter, we talk about rites of passage. The consistent focus that we noticed was they all had an intentional plan for developing and sending out their own people into the world as missionaries. So we actually have 5 chapters in the Pipeline book that were written by those church leaders, and they freely share all their best practices and strategies, and those are listed also on our website and given freely. So I'm just going to go over those 6 things really quickly, and then we're going to focus in on the last one. One of the first ones, education, is sort of what everybody thinks to initially, but it goes beyond just preaching on a Sunday morning. Lately, we've noticed so many more small group studies that are specifically focused on God's heart for the nations and to help people start thinking in that direction. And then, of course, there's so many other things in terms of education, like the perspectives class and things like that. And then there are events, there are the typical missions conferences. Again, there's so many more of those cropping up that are offered, like Urbana, Missio Nexus, of course. And then there's been a lot of success with churches doing their own missions conference, which is very helpful for their local context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then under exposure, people need to hear experiences from those real-life missionaries in person. This has consistently made a huge impact on the people's decision to go themselves. So inviting missionaries to come to your church to speak as often as possible is hugely important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then there's also expectations. It's so important to establish those clear expectations that people can use as markers along their spiritual walk and involvement in missions. So to go on a short-term trip, you'd be required to serve in ministry in some way for a while, or read a biography or something that would help you along. And this helps with the accountability and follow through kind of to the next level, which those are expectations we would have in other areas of life too. And experiences. People need to experience the world outside of their little bubble and outside the walls of the church. So you can serve in the community, like reaching out to the homeless or engaging with internationals. And you can also visit a mission sending organization like Avant up in Kansas City. We would love for anybody to come and visit us up there.
There's an open invitation there. All of these begin with E, and we'll include them in the show notes. Our regular listeners will know that we keep show notes. And these 6 letter E's, or 5 so far, and the 6th one is coming. Let me just run over those 5 E's, though. The first was education. The second was events. The third was exposure. The 4th, expectations. The 5th was experiences. And Lorene, what's number 6 that we're going to drill into?
Number 6 is excursions.
All right. Missions trips, right?
Yes.
Well, if we zoom in a little bit on one of these best practices, excursions, I'll just begin this part of the conversation by asking, why are excursions important in mobilizing a local church for their missions engagement?
So we noticed by our research and our interviews of missionaries who are currently on the field. So we did a broad look at mobilizing. So we started with the church, of course, and then ended up with the missionaries who are on the field. And we noticed that there's 3 things that were in common of everybody that we interviewed who are currently on the mission field. First, the most common denominator of all of them was that they had taken the perspectives course. There was that educational element. The second was that they actually had a personal relationship with a missionary that was on the field when they were a young person, when they were years before they heard God's call to the mission field, they actually had a missionary come to their house or introduce them and got to know them on a personal level at some kind of event. And then the third thing was that all the missionaries who are on the field today had gone on a short-term mission trip at some point in their past. And we kind of boiled those three things down and said, these are the three priorities. And short-term mission trips, not everybody that goes on a short-term mission trip will become a missionary. All the missionaries that we interviewed had been on a short-term mission trip. So we thought, this is an important thing that we need to talk about. And not to just have a short-term mission experience, but to have it very intentionally planned so that it helps expose the participant to the possibility that their lives may be changed by God using them for his greater purpose and long-term career.
Now, in the book, Dave and Lorene, you describe 5 types of these excursions that can help mobilize a local church. Out of these mission trips, we just want to acknowledge they are not all created equal, but we want to talk a little bit about each of these 5. What is the first type of excursion that you describe in your book?
Yeah, the first one, we just labeled it short-term mission trip, short-term trip. And it's basically a weekend or a 2-week, something that's basically using their vacation time, the time away from school, but it's just a very limited exposure. And as a missions pastor, that was one of my number one priorities, is to have something so that young people, even 20-somethings and 30-somethings, that would basically require them to get a passport. If they had a passport, they had to go through all that, then that document, that governmental issued document, opens the world to these people. So that was kind of the purpose, just to have a weekend or a 2-week trip that just required them to get that piece of document that said, I have the world at my hand right here so that I can go. There's a lot of other little things to it, but that was kind of the biggest priority for me as a missions pastor.
And how do you find then that these short-term trips, defined very briefly, you mentioned a weekend or maybe up to a week or two, how can they help churches become more engaged?
Well, once people travel across a border, once they start seeing that there's another world out there, once people who are living in a bubble, and frankly, I was living in Southern California at the time, and there is definitely a bubble there, and there's a wealth inequality just across the border. There's a language border that you have to cross. There's all kinds of economic type things that you're exposed to. So we wanted to just have, on that one brief little trip, cross over into Mexico and see a whole nother world, people who think differently, who speak differently, who act differently, who live in a different type of culture. And that right there, it sets the stage. It's basically, you're setting a stage for something that's coming in the future, which would be God exposing them to a whole nother culture, a whole nother world.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of breaking the ice. Well, I guess that's a Canadian expression, but it's opening the door to people's understanding that there's more than just their own world out there.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes we as Christians get very, very comfortable. And in our churches, we're very safe, we're secure. But then when we step out of that safety and security, we see that God is far more powerful when there's a little bit of change in our lives. I think God uses change in our perspectives to draw us closer to Him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, for those church leaders who may be considering planning a short-term trip or participating in it, even if it's going to be delayed right now in 2020, what are the key principles, or even if you pull out a key principle that they should keep in mind as they begin planning for a short-term trip?
Well, every church is different, and they have a different reason. And just to give you a contrast, I've got 2 churches in my history that I was a missions pastor at. One church was, you're going to take people on a short-term mission trip so that you can introduce the gospel to the participants. So that the purpose was that we take non-believers, non-Christians, on these exposure trips so that they can rub elbows with the Christians that were on our team so that they can be introduced to the gospel. So that was a reason why we had short-term trips. The other church that I was a mission pastor at, our purpose for doing short-term trips was to enhance the efforts of our long-term missionaries. So every time we did a short-term mission trip, it was to benefit the long-term missionary out there on the field. And so the principle here is know your church. Know the purposes and the reasons that your church has for doing short-term trips. Sometimes it's missionary mobilization. Sometimes it's exposure. Sometimes it's, doing all these trips to get the gospel into the hands of unreached people groups. So there's lots of different options, but the first principle is know your church, know who you are. Are you doing social justice work? Are you doing church planting work? Are you doing evangelism, discipleship? All those things are reasons and purposes for each church to wrestle through. Why is it that we're doing this? Don't just do it because the church down the street did it, but why is it that our church is going to do this? What is God calling us to do? Principle number one.
It's a good principle. And I will mention here that we have a number of episodes with regard to short-term missions already posted on the podcast. You can visit the website and filter by short-term missions. And especially I'll mention episodes 68 through 71, which was a mini-series we did on how to do short-term missions with excellence. And so invite you to check those out. I do know the book, of course, and I can say the second type of excursion that Dave and Lorene talked about is a midterm trip. Dave, what do you mean by midterm trips and how can they help churches engage?
Yeah, so midterm is just another time break for churches to consider, for people to go deeper. If the weekend trip and the 2-week trip are for the masses or for larger numbers of people. And I was always with the standards of excellence. And I know that smaller numbers of people are better on short-term trips. But for the midterm, that's for the people who really are sensing God's call in their lives. They're saying, hey, I think that God's calling me to be a missionary, or I want to go into ministry somehow. So the midterm trip is from 2 weeks to 3 months. And it includes summer break for students, college students and high school students that are taking that break. So it's a time frame, but it's a larger commitment for people who already have drank the Kool-Aid or caught the bug, or it's the people who are wanting to go deeper in exploring their potential of full-time ministry.
Mm-hmm. I'm hearing you say you're encouraging people to take a next step in exploring, and they might even be considering something longer term thereafter.
Yeah, we always talked about first steps, next steps, step up, and then step out. And so this would be kind of the step out where they really go and do something more significant than just that trial run.
And we are seeing some young people in particular resonate with this idea of midterm trips. And as we encourage them not to necessarily go for another week-long trip or 2 weeks, but to really take a longer period of time, it does impact their lives in different ways. And that raises some very healthy questions very often about how they would spend many weeks or even months on the field. Well, we've heard about these first two types of excursions, short-term trips and midterm trips. In a moment, we're going to hear about the other three kinds of excursions that your church can consider. Before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share with you this missions resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Are you planning to lead or participate in a short-term mission? The Standards of Excellence in Short-Term Mission can help your church ensure that your mission trip is effective, of high quality, and beneficial to everyone involved. Learn more about the 7 standards right here on the podcast. Check out episodes 68 to 71 to hear our 4-part mini-series called How to Do Short-Term Missions with Excellence. Visit SOE.org to learn more. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back with Dave and Lorene Wilson, co-authors of Pipeline, Engaging the Church in Missionary Mobilization. So far, we have discussed short-term trips and midterm trips. Dave, what's the third type of excursion?
Okay, third, I've classified it as a semester mission trip. And this is specifically for students who are in college. Sometimes it's taking a break from college. And this is one of the things, just from my personal history, from my past, that got me really involved. I was in university, and there was an opportunity for me to go to New York City, and it was for about 3 months. And I spent time in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This was a pretty rough part of town back in the 90s. And I just had this incredible experience where I was walking the streets day and night, and we were evangelizing, working with the homeless population, working with the low income. And I got to know people on a deeper level in 3 months than I would have in just a brief period of time. And this was also in coordination between my church and my university that I was going to. And there was also a mission agency that was involved. So there was levels of partnership that got me to that place because I was working with long-term workers there. I was working with a well-established ministry, and I was actually going in on my own. So we wanted to really highlight the semester mission because this is a pivotal time. We know that the university experience and that age between 17 to 24-year-olds are making significant decisions about the future trajectory of their lives. And so we wanted to include this because a church works really well in partnership with others, mission agencies and with universities. And if you have a good, trusting relationship between these partners, these entities, then that can be a significant period of time for a young person to make those kind of decisions for the future of their lives.
And Avant is got a very structured program for this very type of person that's in college and exploring about missions. And it can be a summer, 3 to 4 months usually, but I know a lot of other missions agencies do the same thing. That's where they're focused in.
Mm-hmm. Well, we really are trying to encourage agencies to explore opportunities for those students who may need to do internships as well. And we don't mean necessarily only Bible schools, by the way, but universities and other vocational schools sometimes require an on-hand experience or hands-on experience. And perhaps that could be accomplished in the mission field, being an intentional Christ follower in some context while that educational requirement is being completed. The fourth type of trip is also sort of related to the student age, right?
Yeah. And so we call it the gap year.
The gap year trip. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, so in what you just mentioned about not just Bible schools or seminaries, but universities, and even with students who aren't taking Bible courses yet, this is particularly important in our new and emerging world that we're having to be very, very careful about who we send out. People who have traditional Bible degrees, seminary experience, they may not have the best open door opportunities and possibilities in their lives because they're flagged. They can't get into some of these closed countries. Some of the places in the world are closed to missionary visas. They're closed to religious workers. They're closed to people who have a red flag in their history for Christianity. And so people who have degrees in education, people who have degrees in medicine, business, law, all those kind of degrees are very important for the missionary enterprise moving forward because we're seeing that we need to send non-traditional missionaries to do mission work in places that are closed to the gospel in a lot of ways. So I always loved thinking of a gap year for a person who is a business major. That's going to be advantageous if they choose to stay on the business track. It's also going to be advantageous if they're in a medical degree. I had a friend that took a gap year, and she went to Nepal. She was in med school. She took a gap year, and she went to Nepal to work for Samaritan's Purse in a hospital there. And that was a transformative time for her. It also gave her a 1-year credit because they had this unique partnership so that they could actually, she could have some of her medical bills paid, her tuition expenses paid, while she was serving with this nonprofit mission organization in a separate area. So these are just some things that we have to think through for the next generation. They're not going to be sent out like the last generation was sent out.
Right, right. Okay, we've got short-term trips, midterm trips, semester trips, gap year trips, and now the fifth one you've entitled stints. What do you mean by stints?
Okay, so sometimes what we in the mission agency receive is people who come to us and say, we really haven't been very good at anything else in our lives. So we think God's calling us to be a missionary. And they lay out how nothing else has really worked for them. And then they come to us and they say, we think that we want to be sent as missionaries through your organization. But they haven't been tested yet. We don't know how they're going to work with other people. We don't know what their skill, their capacity for getting along with each other. So a stint is a test phase. And this is largely on the mission agency side. But for churches to understand, if you want to send people well, you can send people all day long. You can send people on a mission field and pay their support and all that. But if you want to send people well, the people need to be tested. They need to be proved. And they need to go through kind of the refining phase of missionary sending. So we really would like to encourage churches to say, okay, if you're going to be called and sent by our church, we want to make sure that you're going to endure the rigors of the mission field experience. And instead of sending you for a lifetime for a career ministry, we want to send you for the first 2 years. Just send you for a year or two to make sure that everything is going to be well, that you're going to fit with the agency, that the agency is going to fit with our church, all these kind of things. So the stint is kind of like a 2-year dating period before the marriage actually takes place for long-term sending.
It's very helpful to see these different types of trips and the way that they could be leveraged by a local church to help learn about their congregation and who might be fitting longer term. It seems to me that most of them are with the idea, it's not an endpoint, right? It's ongoing. This is part of a journey.
That's right. Yeah, we called it a pipeline, called our process a pipeline for a reason. We want to see progress. We want to know what the end is. And that most of these things, short-term trips, are a means to the end. It's the way, the path forward. It's the pipeline to get to the eventual destination, which would be long-term career missions.
I just want to mention real quick, we've talked a lot about young people, but we don't want to forget the retirement age. Well, others all in between, but that's a huge opportunity, people that are approaching retirement. We've seen that firsthand in our churches, that people that were feeling led to, instead of going into a typical retirement phase, they felt called to go overseas. It's not too late when you're in your 60s and looking into retirement and want to do something significant. So let's not forget that age.
Well spoken, Lorene. Yeah, great idea there. And you yourself may be at or near or just past what has been a classical retirement age, or maybe you know someone in your church that has energy and opportunity to serve. And there are many viable ways to contribute in God's work at that particular junction too. Now, we've just been able to scratch the surface of this topic. Many of our episodes are just introductory like this. So I want to ask you guys, what resources would you recommend to our listeners who want to learn more about this topic of different types of mission trips?
Well, we love offering free resources to churches. That's what we're all about. We want the church to be more engaged in missions in general and mobilizing, sending, just the whole process. So we've tried to, as much as possible, collected resources from our book and everywhere else that we know and put them on our website. So if you go to our website at 3strandpartners.org, we've got quite a collection there, and we're continuing to add to that list.
Super. And we will include that in the show notes, 3strandpartners.org. And if any of our listeners would like to reach out to you guys, follow up with you with a question, or how could they do that?
Yeah, 3strandpartners@gmail.com. We have that set up just as a special email so that people can send us any kind of questions or learn how to engage more in mobilizing the next generation.
Okay, super. If you'd like to connect with Dave and Lorene, you can reach them at that email address also in the show notes. Thank you very much, you two, for spending this time with us today and for sharing with our audience a bit from your book. We've just scratched the surface on this book entitled Pipeline, Engaging the Church in Missionary Mobilization. May the Lord bless you guys as you go through these interesting COVID-19 days and as you serve the Lord, especially through Avant, but the broader community. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Mags.
Thanks so
Pleasure.
much.
So, while we appreciate that the landscape for short-term ministry has been dramatically changed by this COVID pandemic, we hope this conversation will still provide helpful, thought-provoking ideas as we review and plan and patiently watch for the opportunities that the Lord opens up for short-term ministry in the future. Remember that Dave and Lorene's book, Pipeline, has articles from dozens of authors about church missions mobilization. It really is a great resource. And be sure to check out the other things that they've mentioned on their website at 3strandpartners.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review in Apple Podcast or your favorite app. We really appreciate your feedback, and it helps others decide if they'll give it a try. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. Join us again next week, because this was sort of a bonus episode tucked in here. We will then continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.